I've had this machine here, so I guess it's broke, but it's not all that broke. So I'm just you know, you know. Oh, and so that's kind of like I am with classical music. If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Oh my! All right. Let me go ahead and get started here because it is 7:02 and we don't have a quorum yet, but that's okay. We'll get one here pretty short. I guess with Pat standing sitting here, that I almost got a quorum. So all right, let's let me go ahead and hit the record, and going to go ahead and hit the mute for everyone. Okay, and I guess we're ready to roll. I want to welcome everyone here tonight to to our continuing study on the book of First Kings. Actually, First Kings and Second Chronicles, they go hand in hand for this lesson tonight. We'll be studying the third and the fourth chapters of First Kings, which talks about, among other things, the wisdom of Solomon. And so let's begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. Okay, the time frame that we're talking about here tonight is right around 961 BCE. That's when Solomon was finally came to the throne, was crowned, and keep on saying inaugurated, but when he became the king. And we see that here in these, we're still in the first 10 chapters, and where it talks about him being married and so forth. So that's kind of where we're going to be talking about tonight. And then over here in Second Chronicles, that would be this part here in the first chapter of Second Chronicles. We'll be looking at that tonight. Next week we'll jump actually into the business of the temple, building the temple, and the materials used, the design of it. Maybe we'll even talk a little bit about the location of it, because many of you know I kind of look at I'm not really, well, I'm not sure at all that it was on the Temple Mount. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. But anyway, we'll maybe talk about that next week. Yeah, they asked me to come back and speak with that political group again, but I decided, nah, I'd rather just be with my class than go do that political stuff. So, all right, I think we'll keep going on. So here again is the map that we used last week of the of Solomon's empire, what it looked like at the very height of his kingdom. And the thing about it is, he didn't have to fight any of that to gain control of that area. He he basically just inherited the entire thing from his father David, and so that was he had actually like 40 years, an unprecedented 40 years of peace for Israel, and they did quite well. They prospered, and but that was the area that this orange area here was actually what he actually ruled. And then the yellow areas were areas where he had had control. I mean, he had economic control. All right. Now, what happened? What was going on in the rest of the world here at the time of that Solomon became the king of Israel? Well, if you look over in the Far East, the Zhou dynasty, uh, which I don't know that much about it. It was an important dynasty. It lasted 800 years, and a lot of the um, philosophies and religions of China came out of this time, and they were the basis for the Chinese belief in later eras, such as Confucianism and Taoism. And so this was kind of a fertile ground for the Chinese, and really about half of the world's population at this time, around 1000 BCE, half of the world's population lived in China, actually lived in the Zhou dynasty. So there was um, about I think I read where there were about 50 million people in the world at that time, and fully half of them lived right in this area here um, in China. And then, of course, in the Middle East was there was a goodly amount of people there in Middle East, and so here is a a map that tells us kind of where some of um, the other civilizations, the other nation states, and so forth, um, they were active in this 1000 BCE time frame. You see down here that the Egyptians, of course, that was the 21st dynasty of Egypt, and at this point, uh, Egypt was kind of in decline. They had really when Israel left, God pulled Israel out of Egypt in 1446 BCE, and here we are 400 or 500 years later. Um, Egypt had really declined. They had lost a lot of their power and influence over the world. And then down here, Cush, this area is where the Queen of Sheba came from, and so that's where that is. And you look at some of these others, Assyria, for instance. If you look in Assyria, um, they were kind of in a declining position at this point. They had kind of bottomed out. They still had the best equipped and probably one of the most successful armies in all of the Middle East. However, uh, they were not all that influential at this time in history. Now, 400 or 500 years later, oh yeah, they were a major force, and they covered a good bit of all of the Middle East and the surrounding areas. And you see, of course, the Edomites, where that was, we were familiar with Edom, and then the Aramaean kingdoms. Now that's one of the things where Abraham, was from up here in Ur and the Chaldees, and his that's one of the things that when the people of Israel would come in and give their offerings at at Sukkot, that one of the things that they would recite was that a deal about my father was a wandering Aramaean, and he came across and did this and that and the other, and so that was a recitation that was required of each person as they brought their gift, their basket of first fruits for the Shavuot um, uh, celebration, or the Sukkot celebration. And let's see, Babylon was not really a force at this time in 1000 BCE. And here's some of the other um, you may or may not have heard of some of these ones. The Cimmerian tribes, and the Phrygians. Of course, you got the Caspians, which today is in the Caspian Sea, and so forth. So these this is kind of what it looked like at that point. Now, if you look over in Europe, there was nothing. Europe had just faded. At the end of the Bronze Age, that time frame, the world went into and that was about. I think it's about 1400 BCE. The world kind of went into a big depression right at the end of the Bronze Age. That was when Israel was leaving Egypt, and other things happened, and so the Greek society of that time, it went into the Dark Ages, and Europe was nothing but cavemen. There was really nothing there in Europe, no real civilization at all. And in the New World, there was a group of people down in what we called the Bay of Campeche, in the New World, and they were actually, it was kind of interesting because they had an alphabet. They had a fairly advanced infrastructure, and they just kind of like they had popped out of nothing, and so it's just kind of interesting to see that they were there long before the Aztecs or the Mayans. They were called the Olmec civilization, and but that's basically what we had worldwide. Of course, Australia was not developed at all, and it still had their Aboriginal tribes there, but there was no advanced civilizations at all down in Australasia, that area. So that's where we are worldwide in when Solomon ascended to the throne in Israel. And so you can kind of see how that was kind of a big deal, even though, we look at Israel today and we say, well, that's not a very big place. How could that have wielded that much influence and power? But when everything else was pretty much not developed, then the idea of Israel being a developed nation, they were kind of powerful for their time, but they were not particularly conquering. They were not like the Greeks under Alexander, where they were going out and conquering the world. No, they got their part, the part that God said that that was theirs, and they just went about settling that and developing that particular territory. They were not expansive hardly at all certainly not after David. Okay, and any comments or questions that anyone might have at this point of what I've kind of pointed out in terms of the history, or what the globe looked like at that point? Okay, remember, we're in at this point, kind of mid-Iron Age. And so at this point, Israel had come fully out of the Bronze Age, so their weaponry was up to speed. They had the chariots with the iron rimmed wheels, and their weapons were steel, or iron at least, and so that they would be successful in defending themselves against other nations. You'd remember when they were fighting in Canaan to conquer Canaan, Israel was still in the Bronze Age with bronze weapons, and the Canaanites, many of the Canaanite tribes had iron weapons, especially those that had come into contact with the Phoenician people group, because they were fairly well advanced into the iron technology. All right, so let's look then at the first verse of 1 Kings 3. It says, Then Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marriage, taking Pharaoh's daughter and bringing her to the city of David until he finished building his own house, the house of Adonai, and the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, you might be in a position when you're just looking at this and you say, okay, so he married some gal from Egypt. So what? Big deal. Well, it was a big deal because, number one, they were not supposed to marry outside of Israel, and that was pretty. The Lord was pretty adamant about that. That you keep it. You marry a nice Jewish girl. That's all. That's what you're supposed to do. Don't even look at those other ones. That's they got a religion that's mashugana. That's they're crazy. They're evil. They're pagan. They're and many of them were under judgment of God because of their religious practice. And so God says, do not marry into that, because they will bring their religion in. And next thing you know, the men of Israel will be going along with the religion of their bride. And so for all of their talk about being the man of the house and everything like that, what we found in reality was that these young ladies from that part of the world can be very, very persuasive. And so that's just the way it was. All right. So Solomon made this alliance with the king of Egypt. Now, he obviously he should not have married Moabite or Ammonite or Edomite or Sidonian, Hittite, any of those. Obviously he's not going to marry those. Those were Canaanite religions in some cases, but we can't really say that he should have married the Egyptian. Now there's some that said, well, because it was Egypt, it's okay that he could marry a girl from Egypt. But I would say, no, it probably wasn't okay, but he did it anyway. But what it does do by telling this story here, that Solomon had married the daughter of a Pharaoh. All right. What is amazing here is that pharaohs did not give their daughters to be married to foreigners. Okay, it just didn't happen. It was not something that they did ever. And so the very fact that they did this, it showed a couple of things. Number one, it showed that Israel had really gained a lot of power and prestige. And so compared to then Egypt had declined significantly during this 400 years, 500 years that Israel had, the children of Israel had left Egypt. Egypt had declined significantly. They'd been beat up by the Phoenicians and the Philistines and so forth. So they were in a weakened state, and so the very idea that the Pharaoh of Egypt would then offer his daughter up to be the wife of the king of Israel kind of shows that, okay, he looked at Israel as a threat, as somebody that could come in and really wreak havoc with his economy, with his soldiers, with everything. So by offering up a daughter to Solomon. That was one way of saying, okay, let's be friends, let's play nice. And it was because he could not go out and fight Israel, because he thought he would lose. So now we see that Solomon had an Egyptian Pharaoh for a pa-in-law. So that was just kind of an interesting thing. So this kind of shows then the difference of between Israel and Egypt. At this point in life, Israel was actually stronger than Egypt was, and so that the Pharaoh there, he was a guy named Siamun, and it's just almost without parallel in Egyptian history that he would give up his daughter. So big big flag there, red flag there, that says that Egypt is in decline, and um, that they would never give up their daughters. So that kind of shows us then that Solomon enjoyed a great deal of influence around the world, and that he could take this Egyptian girl into Jerusalem, and he put her up in a nice house, but it wasn't the palace yet. He hadn't built the palace, so he brought her and kept her nearby until they'd gotten the palace done. And then the verse said that um, Solomon finished building the wall around Jerusalem. Josephus reports that he built the walls around Jerusalem much larger and much stronger than they had been before. So that was one of the things that Solomon did early on. And next week I'm going to be showing you some other innovations that Solomon did when we were at Megiddo. You could see the what they call a Solomon's Gate, and it was a particular archaeological, or archaeological is what the right word, architectural design of how they built the cities with these gates and that they're called a Solomon Gate, or a Solomonic Gate, that was very effective in warding off invading armies that would try to come through the gate. So it was a good secure system, and we'll probably be showing you some pictures of that next week. First Kings. Any comments or questions so far? Like I said, if you got a comment or question, just jump in there and hit the unmute button and ask away. Okay, and First Kings 3:2-3 says, the people, however, were still sacrificing on the high places, because there was no house built for the name of Adonai until those days. Now Solomon loved Adonai, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he kept sacrificing and burning incense on the high places. All right, so the Israelites were they were sacrificing to Adonai in these high places. That in fact, there's some archaeological evidence of that in what they call the Shamrock Tablets, that describe open air sanctuaries throughout the land of Israel, and where they would come up and they would probably have like a one tall stone sticking up or something like that, and kind of like a Washington Monument thing, only not that big, only maybe as high as a man, or a little bit taller than a man, and they would offer sacrifices around that area. And it would be up on a high mountain area, or at least a big hill promontory. Um, and so that's what they were doing. And so they did that all over Israel. And so these, the Israelites then took over these areas from the Canaanites, and they just kind of followed in along with the Canaanites. The Canaanites were offering, offerings to their God. Well, then Israel says, well, we can do that to our God too. We can offer, although God says, do not do sacrifices until I tell you where you can do sacrifices, meaning for the most part, meaning in Jerusalem. But they didn't do that, and they still did sacrifices, even though they were sacrificing to the one true God. God had told them, no, don't do sacrifices just anywhere, on these hilltops. Plus, he said that's where the Canaanites were doing their offerings and so forth. I don't want offerings where they'd already polluted the ground. Goodness. And so, but they never quite got over that. And, it wasn't before the Mosaic law, it wasn't an issue because God hadn't told them not to do it. They weren't in the land, and like when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were in the land, they could offer up sacrifices, wherever, because it was not a requirement for them to only do it in Jerusalem. So, what was happening here is that Solomon was still doing this, and the people were doing that, and now Solomon, he went to one of the high places we'll see in the next few verses, that he offered these sacrifices. Now, it talked about that Solomon loved Adonai. Now, what does that mean? It says, now he loved Adonai, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that this one little big deal that he kept sacrificing and burning incense in the high places, which was basically a form of idolatry. And so it's it's kind of a big deal when you say you're following God's statutes, except for this one here where we're offering sacrifices someplace else. I mean, it'd be like being married to your wife, and he says, "Well, I'm faithful to her except for on Tuesdays. It's okay." Um, and because that's our bowling night, and what happens after bowling. So I know I'm being kind of trite on that, but that's kind of what it looked like, that God said do not do this, and yet they did. They offered excuses for it, uh, but it was not really an excuse why they were not a valid excuse why they would do that thing. Okay, until later on when God said, no, I want you to do this in Jerusalem. And by this time in their history, he had already said, yeah, you're going to do this in Jerusalem. So there was no excuse at all for Israel to be doing these sacrifices anywhere else. And we'll even see later on in the history of Israel that how far afield that actually got with them. So, but the idea that Solomon he followed God's footsteps like his father did, David, and he loved the Lord, but he just had some problems with following all of it. Just that's just the way it was. And we don't know, what the deal is with Solomon. Did he at the end of his life repent of his wrongdoings like David did? We don't know. It's not written in the Bible, and we don't see it in any of the Psalms or any of his other writings. So who's to say? I'm glad I'm not the judge. So just that little bit of sacrificing on the high places, that was kind of an end, just something um, where the water could seep through the cracks, and eventually it got the area wet again, and pretty soon you had a regular leak. All right, going on. I wanted to show you the Rosh Shamra tablets, and this is the where they've uh, actually put them together. Um, they found them like this, and they kind of put them together, and then of course you can see right over here exactly the writing, and along with other things, it's talking about Israel and so forth, and how uh, Israel uh, beat the Braves in overtime, and they. Oh, you can't see that? All right. Okay. Well, sure looks like it to me and all of that. But going ahead in verse 3, 4, and 5. Um, so the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Upon this very altar, Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings. At Gibeon, Adonai appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask for what should I give you?" Wow. So the Mosaic tabernacle with its bronze altar was it was in Gibeon. It's 4, 5, 6 miles northwest of Jerusalem, but it was in a high area, and it was actually had been one of the principal high places of Canaan. And then the tabernacle, when it was, for many years, for 400 years, it was over there in Shiloh. And then the Philistines, you remember the story, the Philistines came over there, and where they had captured the ark, and then they kept on going over to where the tabernacle was. But by this time the priest had packed up the tabernacle and headed down, and they'd gone down and to more into the central part of Israel. And then they set up the camp there. Then the tabernacle was at Nob, N-O-B. And you remember then that Saul slaughtered a bunch of the priests at Nob. And so then at that point, they moved, it was probably moved then on up to Gibeon, which was a fortified city, whereas Nob was not. And so the Saul went up there, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings. Now you look at it, and I read all sorts of these commentators and said, and there are always some that said 1,000. Well, what that meant was, no, there was probably the the decimal point was not in exactly the right spot, and the scribes, they may have miscalculated, misprinted it or something like that. And 1,000 burnt offerings, that would be way too much. But at the same time, this was Solomon, and he did things kind of over the top. And so 1,000 burnt offerings, that's a lot. But then God appeared to Solomon at night in a dream and asked, what should I give you? Now, dreams were not the normal way that God spoke to people. They in many cases, well, shoot, I guess he spoke to people sometimes later on. He spoke to Nebuchadnezzar's grandson by writing with his finger on the wall. And then earlier, when Israel was trying to go up and conquer the land, and Baal decided, well, I'm gonna have to get Balak to go over and put a curse on these guys. Well, God spoke through a donkey, And so, uh, he could speak in various ways, but dreams didn't seem to be a definitive way that God spoke to people. And I know in dreams, everybody's got dreams. You dream, and for me, I have dreams quite frequently, and it just depends on the variety of pizza, how what kind of the dream could be. And sometimes they're really crazy. And I was telling Pat tonight, I dozed off and took a little daydream there, a little nap. And in the nap, I dreamed that some people from down south were making their way north, and they went through our property, and they were hungry and decided to avail themselves of Pat's two chickens. And I looked at that and I said, well, okay. That way, I guess, they were roasting her two chickens. I said, well, I guess that way we don't have to buy any more organic chicken feed. And then by that time, then I woke up. It was just crazy dreams. So now, what is that? What what does that mean? Well, I don't know that that would mean anything. But then there are other times where you have dreams that are definitely something from God, and I think this was one of what happened here. God spoke to Solomon, and um, when Solomon went through there and he offered 1,000 sacrifices. Well, sacrifices were a way that man could then uh offer up to God, and kind of make a statement to God and kind of show their devotion to God. And so Solomon had 1,000 that showed his appreciation to Hashem. And so God looked down at that and says, yeah, I think Solomon is trying to say something here. So that night, then he came to Solomon in a dream, and Solomon knew that that was a different kind of dream. That was not a pizza dream. Okay, that was one that he said, and he took note of it. That he made sure that he remembered, because if he's like me, if I didn't have a piece of paper and a pencil right there on the table by the bed, and made a habit of waking up and writing down my dreams, I would not remember my dream from the time that I lifted my head up off of the pillow until I got off of the bed. I mean, once I'm up on my 2 feet, then there goes my dream. I don't remember it anymore. And but Solomon knew this, and he made note of it. And so God says, what do you want me to do for you? And Solomon then, he was only about 20 years old here at this point, about 19 to 20 years old. So I got to hand it to him. How many of us as teenagers would have had the good sense to that Solomon did, when God says, hey, what can I give you? And um, I don't know what a teenager at that time of life would have said, but uh, it could have been something like, I want lots and lots of money. I want to live for a long time, and I want all the girls to like me, and something like that. And they didn't have BMWs back then, but had they had that, that would have been high on my list too. So, but Solomon just, he acknowledged how good God had been to his father David, and then he just told God, he says, "Look, I am just a child." The word that he used in Hebrew was um, Na'ar, which can be translated as little child, or but it means an immature person, one who had not fully developed all of the skills necessary of, say, adulthood and so forth. So, um, what he did then was he just asked God, says, well, look, I'm young, I'm the king now, I need to make good decisions. If you would give me the ability to make the right decisions all the time. So, what kind of a state, a guy like that to come up with a request for that. Um, because here he said, so give your servant a mind of understanding to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? Wow, the perfect request, I would think. And one that for all of the things that Solomon got in trouble for later on, uh, the idea of asking God for wisdom was just phenomenal. So God was so pleased with that request that he had asked for wisdom instead of all of these other juvenile things. That he says, "Okay, I'm going to give you wisdom, but at the same time, because you asked for this, and you'll have wisdom, I'm going to give you the wealth, the power, the fame, everything else that could come along, and because you're going to have enough wisdom to handle it and be and to take care of it properly." But it didn't quite work out that way, because God had told him, don't get a lot of wives, don't get a lot of horses. And um, he ended up having over a thousand wives, and um, my goodness, that's a lot. We'll just leave it at that. And so, because these women, they were a lot of them from different countries, they had different morals, they had different religions, of course. And because of that, Solomon kind of just slumped off into idolatry. And that was kind of a sad thing. But anyway, going back to his wisdom, he just didn't use his wisdom very well. That's all I'm saying. All right, so let's read this story. Everybody is very familiar with this story, but I'm going to go ahead and read it in 16 through 28. It says, later, two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One woman said, my lord, please, this woman and I live in the same house, and I delivered a child while she was in the house. On the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth to a child while we were together, with no one else with us in the house, just the two of us in the house, just the two of us. Now, no one was else. Okay, so she repeated it to make sure that Solomon, the wisest man in the world, kind of figured this out. So this woman's child died during the night because she lay on top of him. And then she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your handmaid was asleep. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead child at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my child, he had just died. When I looked at him closely in the morning, I realized that he was not the son I had born. But the other woman said, no, no, for the living one is my son and the dead one is your son. Thus they spoke before the king. And then the king said, the one who says, this is my son who is living and your son is dead, while the other one says, no, your son is dead as the dead one and my son is the living one. He says, let me get this straight here. Then the king said, okay, I got it. Bring me a sword. And so they brought a sword before the king. And then the king said, okay, divide this living child up in two and give half to one woman and half to the other woman. Then the woman whose son was living spoke up to the king and said, for her heart grew tender for her son. She said, no, my lord, please give her the living child, but only don't kill him. But the other one said, it'll be either okay, neither mine or yours. Cut it in half. And so then the king responded by saying, give this woman the living child, and certainly don't kill him. She is the mother. Then all Israel heard of the verdict that the king had given, and just were in awe of the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. All right, now this was a very, very it could have been a very difficult case. We look at it now today in our world and says, well, sure, I knew that. But back then they had no witnesses. It was a he said or she said kind of a thing. And there was no one to make that kind of determination. And so what it had already, I'm sure it had already gone through their normal court system up to the point where the judges had gotten to Solomon and said, "Look, we don't know. We can't figure this one out. So we're bumping this up to the king." And the king was supposed to, that's what he was king for, to decide these difficult things. And so, in fact, there's a story of a Thracian king, and he was asked to choose between three men. Each one of them were claiming that they were the son of a dead Cimmerian, Cimmerian, Cimmerian king. That's up in the northern regions of Turkey, and each one of them said, "No, I'm the heir. I'm the one." And so he got all three guys together, gave them a spear each, and told them, "Okay, throw a spear into the corpse of this dead king." And one of them said, "No, I can't do it. I can't do it." So the king then knew that the one who would not thrust a spear into the body of his father, that he was actually the actual heir. So now this story here with Solomon and the baby, splitting the baby, really, what more can you say? I mean, it was like uh, the that Solomon, wow, the wisdom of this was very, very powerful to the people of Israel, and they looked and they said, "That looks like we have got a very wise and discerning king, and that's a good thing." So that was what that was. That story, it really put uh, legs on the tail of the wisdom that Solomon got from God. Any comments or questions so far on that? Okay, so I'm going to finish off here with and oh yeah, there's a picture. I found all sorts of pictures of you know splitting the baby, and so that was one fat little baby. All right, and so there are a lot of other ones out there. So I don't really know, but I can just imagine how that would have played out in front of the king. All right. So then chapter 4, it's a listing of the officials in the administration of Solomon. And um, what's interesting here is, okay, Solomon, the stories that we see in First Kings are not in chronological order. Okay, they're there, but they're more thematic rather than chronological. And so the reason for that is because it's there to tell a story that the writer is trying to get out. And so what is he doing? He's listing these officials. You say, how boring. Yes, it is, especially if you were to have to get up there and read all of those things in front of a congregation, that you would say, some of the stuff that, okay, well, and this guy, oh, this guy here, difficult name, was in charge of the army. This guy here, difficult name, was in charge of the food supplies. And this guy here, Difficult name. Another, things like that. And you just kind of go look through them. And if you're reading to get through your Bible reading for the day, you go, and then you're done. You don't even read through the thing. But what it is though is a listing of it shows the details of Solomon's reign and how that it was a well run, oiled uh, administration. And I was also doing some reading here that talks about how much you'd think, wow, this is Solomon's kingdom here. It took a lot because they talk about how much it took for each day for the food and bread and all that. But then when they compared that and they said, yeah, that's a lot of stuff for these guys, a lot more than anybody else in the country gets to eat. Well, that was nothing compared to the budget of say, the Babylonian court system. And uh, this was very, very modest, even though it was super and it was wonderful. It was still modest compared to the Babylonians or the Assyrians or whomever. So, but that's this listing of the officials was not in chronological order, as I said, because it talks about a couple of the guys there that were that had married Solomon's daughters. Two guys there married Solomon's daughters. So this would have had to been halfway through Solomon's reign as the king of Israel, and so we don't exactly know when it was, but it couldn't have been right at the very beginning of his reign because he talks about that. And then he also talks about other things. The guy that becomes the high priest, that would have also been um, a long time coming because the high priest it would just they talk about being the grandson of the high priest. Well, he would have had to grown up first, and so we just know that these are there to tell a story and show us that Solomon had a good administration, even though it was a big deal. He had uh, a lot of bureaucracy, like any government is going to have. It was still better than the Babylonians, but it was a lot worse than what the Israelites were used to. And it's something that Moses had told them. He says, one of these days you're going to get a king, and he's going to tax you, and you're going to grumble, and you think, oh, this is the worst. And he said, told you. That's exactly what happened here with Solomon. And then after Solomon, we're kind of spilling the beans here, but Solomon's son was even worse. And they advised him, okay, you got everything built up now. Let's slack off on the taxes and the heavy labor and all that. And he says, no. He says, you think that that'll show me as being weak, and so you ain't seen nothing yet. I'm going to just tax these people into oblivion. And if they don't like it, I'm going to take away their lands and their cattle and so forth. So, and that eventually split the nation up, and they had civil war. And Rehoboam went one place, Jeroboam went another place. And from then on, we had Israel and Judah. All right. So that's pretty much what I had listed for tonight, or prepared for tonight. And does anyone have any comments or questions regarding this? I know it wasn't terribly exciting, but sometimes just getting through some of this stuff, you learn a few things, but it's not all that exciting. So any comments or questions anybody might have? Okay, now I'm going to turn off my recording so that then you can comment or question.